A very warm welcome to all of you. Welcome to this conversation with Olivier Sibony. The past year has shown us probably many things, but also just how important good decision-making is in government, and also just how costly the consequences are when decisions are taken that turn out to have been somewhat, maybe suboptimal ones. And it's very easy to call for better decisions, but it's much harder to do something about it. And it's even harder when those decisions are irreversible ones, which need to be taken with very little information and under time pressure. But fear not, that is why we've got Olivier Sibony with us today. We are Staatslabor. We're delighted to be hosting this session with all of you. We're a Swiss government innovation and reform laboratory, and we want to change the way the public sector in Switzerland thinks, acts, and feels. And we do that in two ways: by bringing together pioneers and change makers in government, just like today, just like yourselves, and also by working directly with government entities on innovation projects. My name's Daniel Buerkli. I'm a co-founder and co-director of Staatslabor, and I'll be your host today, together with my colleague Dario Meloni, who's a project manager with us, and I'll be handing it over to Dario in just a minute. We will hear first some introductory remarks from Olivier Sibony, and then we'll segue into a conversation. And without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dario, who will introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Danny. I'm very delighted to introduce today's speaker. I've actually been very much looking forward to this event. On one hand, I have a behavioral science background myself, and on the other hand, also I'm still very surprised by the fact that how little or how few insights from behavioral science have actually been applied to the management of the crisis so far, and or to government policies in general. So Olivier Sibony is a professor at the Strategy and Corporate Policy Department of HEC in Paris and an associate fellow at the Said Business School at Oxford University. His work focuses on the effects of cognitive biases, of behavioral biases, in particular on strategic decision-making, innovation, and transformation. Prior to that, Olivier Sibony spent 25 years with McKinsey in France, as well as in the US, where he was a senior partner. He's also the author of several best-selling books on human decision-making. For example, his book called You're About to Make a Terrible Mistake was awarded in 2019 the Manpower Foundation Grand Prize for the best management book of the year, and it's been translated ever since into a dozen other languages. Now for his upcoming book, which I'm actually really looking forward to, called Noise, a Flaw in Human Judgment. He teamed up with two other, you could say, heavyweights of the behavioral sciences, namely economic Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and Cass Sunstein. And the book will soon be published next month in May. So building on his research and on his vast experience, he advises senior leaders on strategic and operational decision-making. Now, when we look at the leaders in government, as you pointed out, Danny, making decisions can already be tough under normal circumstances, but it's even tougher during a pandemic. And as a result, when we look at the past 12-month decisions of public servants and the process that led to these decisions have faced, you could say, wide criticism. So I'm very interested in our guest that claims, that argues that civil servants can avoid these mistakes, these terrible mistakes, by rethinking their decision-making architecture. Therefore, I'm really looking forward to your presentation and the discussion afterwards as well. Mr. Sibony, thank you very much for being here. Over to you.
Thank you, Dario. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm honored to be addressing this group. A word of preamble. I'm not an expert on government decision-making. I focus mostly on the decision-making of big corporations or small corporations, but mostly business people. And the argument I've been making for a long time is that these organizations, which are full of people who are supposed to have very clear goals and very clear incentives, and who know exactly what they're trying to do, and who are paid to get the results that they're supposed to get, sometimes make terrible mistakes. And I have to say that the COVID epidemic is a terrible thing, obviously, but somehow it has helped people hear my message a lot more than they did before. Because we have seen, as Danny and Dario were explaining, we have seen that even on a very high stakes topic, we can actually see that some very smart people with the right intentions can make decisions that, first of all, are very different from one place to another, and from one country to another, and from one moment to another, sometimes for good reasons, data changes, and sometimes for no reason at all. People are just different and have different perceptions of the reality. So, we've seen firsthand that different people faced with what was essentially the same problem can have vastly different reactions. And second, we've seen firsthand that lots of people, including, not limited to, but including some very smart and well-intentioned people, can actually make some pretty stupid decisions. And that has, I think, rekindled or kindled in Europe the interest in the topic of decision-making in general, and specifically in the topic that I'm going to share with you today, which is how cognitive biases distort decision-making, because you are probably familiar with the vocabulary of behavioral science. The argument I'm making in the book you see here is that a lot of the decisions we make, with, again, the best intentions and the best skills, are distorted by cognitive and behavioral biases, but we can do something to fight that. So what I'm going to try to share with you in the next 15 or 20 minutes, so that we have at least half an hour to address your questions, are a few examples of what those biases are. I'm going to very briefly summarize the basic idea for those who might not be familiar with it. I'm going to share a few examples, which I'm going to borrow from the context of the COVID crisis, so that we have some examples that are vivid and striking. And then I'm going to try to give you a few very practical examples of the tools and techniques that I argue, that I recommend for overcoming those biases, or more accurately, for overcoming the results of those biases, for avoiding the bad decisions that those biases lead to, because as you will see, I don't believe you can overcome your biases. So that's a lot to cover in 20 minutes, but let me try. First of all, what are biases? I'm going to be very quick on this because I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with the basic idea. Biases basically mean that you are not that guy. That guy is the thinker of Rodin, you've recognized him. And the thinker, when he has a decision to make, you know what he does? He sits down and he puts his hand like this, very carefully, and he thinks very hard about what he really wants, what are his needs and his desires and his preferences in the sense that economists give to the word, and what are the options, and he considers all the possible options, and what are the advantages and the disadvantages of every option, and what are the uncertainties and the probabilities and the risks. And in the end, he makes a perfectly rational, calculated decision that has the highest expected utility, meaning that the probability that it will happen multiplied by the payoff is optimal. And this is fabulous. And this is how economists assume that we reason, and how we are taught in school that we should reason. This is how I tell my students in business school that they should make decisions. But the reality, obviously, is that this is not how we make decisions, regardless of what the type of decision is. In fact, a great way to summarize the way we make decisions, and here I'm borrowing from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, is that we have two systems. We have a system one that thinks very fast, and a system two that thinks slowly. The thinker, Rodin's sculpture, is a pure system two, is someone who thinks only slowly, but in reality, our slow thinking is always informed, is always prompted, is always primed by our system one. when we use our system one, we solve lots of problems very effectively. For instance, we can catch a ball. Even this 5-year-old little girl can probably catch a ball fairly easily. She does not actually compute the parabolic trajectory of the ball. She does not know, in fact, that an equation which describes this parabolic trajectory can be computed. Neither do you need to recognize Barack Obama here to think very hard that, oh, I recognize the eyebrows and the teeth and the American flag on the lapel. This must be an American president. Oh, it's Barack Obama. No, you just recognize the guy. And of course, when you cross the street, you don't need to think, oh, I see a car there. It's about 50 meters away and it's traveling at 35 kilometers per hour. So it will be here in 3.2 seconds. So that means I have the time to cross. No, you don't do that. You jump to the solution because you take shortcuts. You use what cognitive scientists call heuristics, shortcuts to get to the solution. You don't need to solve the problem because your system one has shortcuts to get to the solution. We use these shortcuts all the time. The problem is that from time to time, these shortcuts are going to be mobilized for tasks for which they are not adequate, and they are going to lead to systematic errors called biases. Systematic errors meaning that we can predict what those errors are going to be. We can predict that sometimes they are going to be large. And there is a long list of those cognitive biases. I'm not going to walk you through a long list, but I'm going to suggest a grouping of those cognitive biases in 5 big buckets, which are quite easy to remember. The bucket at the top is that we think we recognize what we see. We think we recognize patterns even when we don't. The 2 on both sides are action orientation and stability. Sometimes we're too action oriented. Sometimes we're too anchored on the status quo. And the 2 at the bottom are the context. We live in a social context and we have our self-interest at heart. It's a very, 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 very quick summary of a lot of research on cognitive biases. And so rather than give you more detail on each of these bullet points, let me try to illustrate a few of those biases and how they impact important decisions at the time of the COVID crisis. I'm going to start at the beginning, a year ago, and we're going to move forward in time, and I'm sure you'll have lots of other questions after all. First of all, pattern recognition biases. You see this bizarre thing appear back in January, February, March last year. You remember that? We first hear about this thing from China. We don't know what it's like. How should we respond? A lot of people in Europe said, like this eminent physician who was interviewed on French television on March 6 last year, it's not a big deal. Many of us doctors believe that the overreaction of the politicians is going to be worse than the disease. In fact, by the way, many behavioral scientists thought that people were overreacting because, hey, we've seen a lot of diseases like this. If you're in Europe, this looks like the flu. And it does look like the flu. It does have a lot of things in common with the flu. Of course, we knew it was more severe than the flu, but it looked like a more severe version of the flu. Interestingly, in Asia, the pattern they thought they recognized was a different pattern. They immediately thought, this looks like SARS. Arguably a less severe version of SARS, thank God. But it's a coronavirus, it's a respiratory disease. We've seen SARS before, and we recognize this as something like SARS. Is this something like SARS? I recognize a pattern. Or is this something like the flu? I recognize another pattern. That leads you into a completely different direction. It turns out that Europe was probably underestimating the threat and Asia was not overestimating it. It could have been the opposite. The point is not that you're always right when you're more prudent. The point is that the way you look at the situation, the way you think you recognize what you're looking at, is shaped by the pattern you've seen before. Pattern recognition biases, first big category. Second big category. On March 16 last year, so about almost to the day a year ago, a number of epidemiologists in the US are asked, how many cases of COVID do you think we will have in this country on March 29, which is 12 days hence? Right? So in 12 days, how many cases of COVID are we going to have? What you see on the blue bars here are their answers. And each of these epidemiologists from Harvard, from Johns Hopkins, from the Los Alamos National Laboratory, I mean, eminent epidemiologists, gave a point estimate, which is the blue dot, and a range, which are the extremities of the blue bars. You can see that the average of the points, the consensus of the estimates, was 19,000 cases. 12 days later, the actual number was 140,000. So the average epidemiologist was wrong by a factor of 7. But actually, that's not the point. The point that is really interesting here is not that they were wrong and that they were optimistic, which we can see. The point that is really interesting is that the vast majority of these guys, except for the first 3 there, were extremely confident in the precision of their estimate. You can see that they were given the option to say, it will be between X and Y, and they did not use that option. Instead of saying, well, like the first 3 here, instead of saying, I think it's going to be about 20,000, but really, I don't know. It could be 200,000. Nobody has a clue. They said, no, I think it's going to be 20,000. And if you really want a range, it's going to be between 19 and 21. They had the option of expressing uncertainty, but basically they said, no, we know. This is an action bias called over-precision. It's a form of overconfidence, but very often when people hear overconfidence, they think it means optimism. It does. It means several things. It does mean optimism. Here, what matters is not the optimism, which is here. It is clear. It's the over-precision. It's the fact that we think we know more than we actually know, and we think we can know more than we can actually know. There is a lot more uncertainty in the world than we are prepared to face. That leads us to be over-precise. Action biases. Third example, on March 15 in Paris, I took this picture. This is on the day when a general election had been discussed and finally not canceled, but almost canceled. People already knew that they would be on lockdown a couple of days later. We already knew that there were thousands of people dying in Italy. There was a very real threat, and people were behaving like there was no threat. At the same time, give or take a few days, in Italy, people were observing the lockdown very strictly. There are a lot of reasons for that, but you can see by just looking at these pictures that when you look at the picture on the left, you think there is no danger here. When you think at the picture on the right, you think this is a dangerous place. This is an instinctive reaction, which, by the way, is completely wrong. The danger is where there are people. There is no danger in walking through empty streets. But the empty streets feel scary, and it's very hard to believe that all the people who are sitting on this green in Paris are wrong. We are social animals. We behave like the people around us. It is very difficult to get people to change their behavior before you have a critical mass of people changing their behavior, because when you see people behaving a certain way, it's very hard to believe that they don't have reason to behave in that way. It's very hard to believe that the people around you are crazy. I remember on that note, about 10 days before that, I think it must have been March 8 or March 7, being the only guy in a theater in Paris with a face mask. I can tell you it feels like a very difficult thing to do. People were staring at me. Some people actually shouted at me and said, if you are sick, stay at home. You're crazy. Why are you wearing a mask? Do you want to scare us all? Right? After a while, I actually took off the mask. It was silly, right? I had come with a mask. I knew it would protect others if I was sick, which I had no idea whether I was. I knew it protected me because guess what? I knew it. Anyway, but after a while, the social pressure was so hard that I actually took off the mask because, hey, I don't want to have a fight with the people sitting next to me. That's a social bias. I fell for it. Next example, we remember all these politicians from places like Brazil saying, oh, it won't happen here because we're different. Brazilians never catch anything. We remember less that at the time I was describing, people in France, for instance, and I'm sure it was the same in Switzerland, were completely oblivious to the fact that just a few 100 miles away in Italy, there was a very, very severe crisis brewing. How could we, you see a paper here written by French journalists in Italy, all bending together and saying, hey, we want to write this op-ed on March 12th to make the French aware that this is a really serious crisis and it is coming your way, guys. How can you be ignoring it? And we completely ignored them. We thought, what did we think? We thought, it's Italy. Come on, of course, Italy doesn't know how to manage this stuff. Now, if that sounds crude, if that sounds demeaning, if that sounds silly, here's an example of a highly respected academic in the US at the Hoover Institution explaining in a detailed research paper why what happened in Italy would never happen to the US. The current models radically overestimate the ultimate death toll in the US, which should reach about 500. 500. A week later, he updated it to 5,000. As we know, we are now well above 500,000. So he was wrong by a factor of 1,000 in his first estimate, which he published. This is an academic publishing papers, putting his name on it, making a fool of himself, obviously, but hey, over precision. Now, why will this not happen to the US? Because the healthcare system in the US will not be compromised in the same fashion as the Italian one. Because in Wuhan, air quality was poor and smoking rates are higher. Because in Italy, most of the people are dying because of a conscious decision made not to supply ventilators to older people. Apparently, he seems to think that Italians are barbarians and that they just decide to kill old people, not that they don't have enough ventilators to, and that they have a shortage. Basically, this idea that we are different. There is an in-group to which we belong, and the out-group of people who are experiencing something different is a different group, and that won't happen to us. That's an idea for the Bolsonaros and the Trumps of this world, of course, but it's also an idea that we can all fall for and that we are all very susceptible to, even very smart people like this guy. And finally, another very interesting thing which moves us a bit later into the epidemic. Germany's response to the COVID crisis as described by the world in April and July. And here I've taken not a French view because it would be biased when we speak about the Germans. I've taken the American view. And hey, what does the New York Times say about Germany? Well, something of an example for Western nations, the country that will triumph in the post-pandemic world. Basically, its response to the pandemic, I'm quoting from the New York Times here, has highlighted the pre-existing strength of Germany. The editorial board of the New York Times writes in July that in a crisis, true leaders stand out. And Angela Merkel is, of course, the true leader that they're talking about. And by the way, a core reason why Germany is faring so well, everybody says, is that it's led by a woman. And there seems to be a pattern that nations led by women are faring better with COVID-19. So basically, when you read the explanations at the time of why Germany was doing so much better than Italy or France or the UK when it came to the first wave, you get the explanation that A, they have Angela Merkel, who is a genius and who is a scientist and who really listened to the science. B, she is a woman and women are better at dealing with this crisis for reasons that are not entirely clear, but that seems to be a pattern. 3, Germany is a decentralized country and that has led them respond more effectively and closer to the ground and therefore be much more responsive than the French, for instance, where everything had to be centralized in Paris. Wonderful. Now, as we all know, the second wave didn't go so well. In the second wave, Germany actually suffered a lot more than France or than Italy. What happened? The really interesting thing is when you look at the explanations given by the same people in the same newspapers, the same reasons that had led to the success in the first wave are now invoked to explain the failure in the second wave. Oh, the leadership, well, she wasn't so good after all. The decentralized political model, well, that led to disunity and to the impossibility of making decisions together. The fact that they had shown solidarity with the rest of Europe in the first wave, well, now their hands were tied by the Europeans. How can we explain so easily everything that we see and explain both outcomes with the same reasons. Because basically, we have this amazing ability to look at things in hindsight and to explain everything in hindsight and to find reasons for everything in hindsight. In hindsight, we always knew everything. In hindsight, everything is clear. So I've given you a few examples. All those biases are present in all our decisions, not just in managing this crisis. What can we do about them? I'll try to be quick about this. Basically, let me be quickly try to go quickly. The basic idea is simple. You're always looking at a single decision. Your decision seems unique. Your decision seems like it's one of a kind, but basically it's a game of probabilities. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, if I had to make it 100 times and I wanted to give it the best chance of success, how would I do it? And if you do it that way, I'm sparing you all the details here, but if you do it that way, you can't trust your intuition, your gut feeling, your sense of what should be done in this specific case. You can't trust your beliefs about this specific case. You've got to think about the decision process. Another way of saying what I'm saying here is, don't think of the decision you're looking at now. Ask yourself first what the decision process should be to make that decision, and try to find a process that has the best possible chance of success. If you want to have a process that has the best possible chance of success, that's going to be a process that favors dialogue, favors divergence, and favors sound decision dynamics. And I'm not going to give you a long theoretical explanation of this, but I'm going to try to give you some very practical tools that illustrate what I mean. I'm not saying that these tools should be applied universally. I'm not saying that they even apply to your organization, to your situation, but they illustrate what I mean by stimulating dialogue, creating divergence, and managing the dynamics of the decision. And the reason these kinds of tools will be useful, the reason it's important to create dialogue, divergence, and dynamics is because these 3 Ds, the dialogue, the divergence, and the dynamics, are a way to leverage the collective intelligence of people in the service of overcoming biases. This is a long story, but to try to make it short, as individuals, we will always have biases. They are not going away. With a bit of luck, we won't all have the same biases. So if we work together as a team with good collegiality and a good decision-making process, we might actually have a chance to make the better possible decisions despite the biases. So what are those tools? I'll give you just a couple of examples to illustrate what they are. First, don't do PowerPoint, ask people to write a memo. That's a very simple idea, probably more frequently practiced in government than in big organizations, but PowerPoint makes you stupid. PowerPoint leads to hasty decisions. PowerPoint leads to not seeing the logic in what you describe. So don't do what I'm doing now. Don't present PowerPoint slides. Write memos. I write a lot of memos too, and books. Write memos where you're actually forced to lay out your logic and you will see the flaws in them. That will actually create a much better dialogue. Second idea, very rarely practiced. When you have a group of people who have to make an estimate, take the average of their independent estimates. What I'm showing you here is an experiment that some of you may have seen. If you ask people to guess the number of M&Ms in that jar, and you have a crowd of 50 people who are all looking at the jar, you will get a distribution of their answers that looks like this. And you will see that the average answer is remarkably close to the correct answer. In this example, this is just one example from one of my classes, all but 9% of the people in the room would have been better off trusting the average of the room rather than their own guess. So basically, we think we're smart, but very few of us on any given decision are smarter than the average of all of us. That is true for anything where we make a quantitative estimate as soon as we have a big crowd. And that is true as soon as we have reason to believe the estimates are independent of each other. It does not work when we talk to each other and we influence each other. It only works if we make our estimates independently. So a very practical thing you can do when you have to agree on a number is, before you start talking about it, ask people to write down that they think and calculate the average and anchor your decision on that number. That's a very good way to leverage the divergence and to build the dialogue of that divergence. Third example, Test and learn, test and learn, test and learn. Don't think you've got the answer before you've tested it. I'll take a very simple example. We've all got ideas of how to communicate to get people to get vaccinated. We all have beliefs about what works and what doesn't. By the way, when I say we all have beliefs, that includes scientists who specialize on this topic. One of my colleagues in, a large group of researchers, in fact, in Wharton published a paper a few weeks ago where they showed that they have tested, I think, 19 different messages to get people to increase the vaccination rate. And each of those 19 messages was proposed by one of those eminent scientists who thought it was the message that would win. It turns out that many of those messages do not increase the vaccination rate at all. Some do, and the one that works, there was no reason to guess that it would be that one and not another one. This was tested on tens of thousands of people. If you don't test it, you can't learn. Now, surprisingly, most governments and most administrations insist on deciding centrally what will work and then rolling it out without doing a test. If you don't test, you can't learn. If you can't learn, you can't improve. If you don't improve, you will very often fail. And finally, a very, 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 very simple and practical thing you can apply to any discussion, because you are going to have meetings and you are going to talk in those meetings. And even if you've taken an average of your thoughts before, you are going to need to talk. Here's a very simple idea. Whenever you do these, let's go around the table and ask everybody what they think, which I'm sure you do in every meeting that you stand in, because you want to hear everybody's opinion. Before you do that, ask people individually to take 30 seconds in silence and to write down what they are going to say. Why? Because if you are the leader of the meeting and the first person has said yes, and the second person has said yes, and the third person has said yes, and the fourth person has said yes, and you are that fifth person who now has to speak, it's very hard to say no. Even if you thought the answer was no, even if you had good reasons to say no. And the result is that you're probably going to say, yes, it's a good idea, let's do it. And no one is going to hear the reasons you had to think it was not a good idea. That is groupthink. That is how terrible decisions get made. Writing before you speak is a way to nudge you gently, to gently prompt you to say, well, okay, I've heard you. There's 4 people who think yes. 5 minutes ago, before you spoke, I thought no. And I wrote the reasons why. I'm going to tell you what my reasons were. I've been half convinced by what you said, but I still want to tell you what I thought 5 minutes ago. That's going to make the dialogue a little bit better and to change the dynamics of the decision making. I've given you 4 examples. I've chosen you intentionally to be very, very, very simple and down to earth. Again, the principle they illustrate is that we should try to change the way we make decisions and to try to change our decision-making process. We are not going to get smarter. We're not going to be perfect. We're always going to remain biased. We are not going to escape our biases. Trying to learn to de-bias ourselves is doomed to fail. What we can do is change the way we make our decisions, and we can do that with very simple tools, very simple practical techniques that gradually improve the way we make decisions. So I've spoken a little bit longer than I said I would, but I hope we have a lot of questions and remarks and suggestions that we can then discuss for the next 25 minutes. Thank you for your attention.